today really is simulations and serious games. And a lot of interesting people are engaged in defining the next generation of solutions, more in a higher quality, and at the same time looking at how we can scale some of these to become a very normal part of our curricula or our experiences when we are learning or training. And that's really the focus of this day and the session, the workshop that Clark will be taking on at 4:15. So is Devabrata here yet? No? Okay. I'll check. But we have Clark and we have Jatinder and Siddharth out here, and I think we'll be joined by one more speaker a little later. Great. Thank you. So, Clark, all yours.
Thank you. Stand at a podium. I once did a talk 3 times for some folks, and one of the places they had me give it, I had to stand behind a podium because they didn't have a wireless mic, and I asked afterwards, how was it compared when I could roam free versus when I was staged behind a podium? She said, up behind a podium you were really tense and uncomfortable, you know? So I'm going to range free. Here. I don't know where we'll clip this. A welcome. And for those in the back, you can move up. It's much better up front. Trust me, the air conditioning's better or something, whatever it is. You don't have to. I just, if you really want to get the most out of it. And as I did before, you've seen the coat now, so I can take it off. When I start pacing around, I'll just generate too much heat. Otherwise, the air conditioning won't be able to cope. So, all right. And welcome, I like the calm image before the storm. So here's the question we start with. Look at games like this, a racing game, a SimCity, a simulation, World of Warcraft. Do people learn in these? Yes. Yeah, of course, they do. So the question is, can we tap into this? In fact, they learn deeply. They invest large amounts of time and effort in mastering these. Can we take advantage of this for learning? And obviously, I want to suggest the answer is yes. A little bit about my background. My first job out of college, and you don't want to know how long ago that was designing and programming educational computer games. And it's just been a recurrent theme through my work. I do other things, as if you were here yesterday. I do mobile, I do adaptive systems, I do content models. Increasingly, I do organizational learning technology strategy. But it's just recurred. I took my PhD thesis and built a game as a research environment for studying analogy. The game that we did to help kids who grow up without parents, you'll see much more about that. What catalyzed the thinking that is going to be laid out today. And I've subsequently done that for a variety of clients, including folks in the US and in India and other places. So just a little bit of background over only about 30 years or so, okay? Not much. I want to situate in this frame, and I admit I'm cheating. The Learning X.0 I'm not part of, but I'm going to sneak in my Learning X.0 model anyways, and in the guise of showing where games fit in. Partly this is a reaction. So many of our learning models allow us to consider content dump and knowledge test as a learning experience. And I really resist that. I really fight against it. So this is my faint attempt, and this is still embryonic. I found it on a laptop. I must have created it sometime, and I just found it a few weeks ago. And I looked at it with fresh eyes, and I thought, this is really good. And the core is that the curricular are a series of activities, not content. As you engage in the activities, then you are motivated to go to the content. And there's lots of ways this unpacks I'm not going to go into right now. But as an output of your activities, there's products created, and even you may also create reflections that are a rationale and a portfolio. And together, that's your product that you can take away with you. But the learning happens, and then peer, self, or mentor evaluation that guides the creation of new paths of activity. And there's role for mentors that develops 21st century skills if you're doing right tools. It goes on and on. Eventually, by helping the learner understand this own framework, they take responsibility. Because you being here is you having chosen an activity for your own development. And that's the notion that we want to segue people from this sort of prefixed for learners who don't know what they need to know or why it's important, to the stage where they're taking responsibility for their own learning. And the reason I mention this is situate games where they fit. They are not a learning experience in and of themselves. I think it's a really interesting research project to try and embed all the content and all the examples into the game, but I still think you need external reflection to get the maximum output. So they're an activity, they're learning practice. And we'll revisit that shortly, but I just want to be clear about what I see the role of learning is, and of course to try and sneak in this representation. I'm looking for feedback on it, I've blogged it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So talking about a practice experience, what makes an effective practice experience? And here's a hint, when you see a big question like that on the screen with nothing on it, that's to you. What makes an effective practice experience?
To engage in the thought process.
To engage in the thought process, you have to be consciously applying the thought.
You're able to repeat the performance even out of the system, even out of practice.
Well, that's an outcome. But what makes a practice experience that leads to that leads you to be able to do it outside? That's the question I'm asking. Pattern recognition. So it has some context for you to recognize the pattern that makes it applicable, yeah?
Doing something and feedback at the same time.
So you act and then get feedback and they're tightly coupled, yeah? I love this. You guys are active, yeah? So it's safe to fail in another sense, so you don't mind taking chances and continuing, yes?
Strategy development in the mind.
So there's an opportunity.
Apply to conceptualize and apply to the real life also.
There are choices to be made, and you make a plan about how you're going to do it.
Different stimuli, different kinds of stimuli.
Different kinds of stimuli. Who was? Immersion. So it's contextualized so you feel like you're actually in an environment performing. Yeah.
What makes effective practice experience would be self-correction. So the game would become increasingly difficult as you play better. It becomes.
It might adapt to you, indeed. And it turns out, and I have done this, my PhD was in cognitive psychology. I've looked at cognitive learning, but I didn't want to stop there. And I tutored the behavioral psychology classes and took them because I wanted to understand them better. I've looked at social learning. One of my PhD advisors had translated Vygotsky from the original Russian. And I've even looked at machine learning, trying to understand learning. If you look across learning theories, if you look across them, you will find repeated elements. And not every element is in every theory, but they show up again and again and again. Clear goals about what you need to achieve. An appropriate level of challenge that adapts to you. It's contextualized, so you're immersed in a real problem, and it's anchored in that it's a problem you really know and care about. It's relevant to you, and you're active. You have to make choices. You have to commit yourself, and then and you act on the world in the ways close to the way the world you would act in the real world, and there's rapid and appropriate feedback, and it maintains your attention throughout. I give credit to John Keller, one of the few instructional design theorists who's actually concerned about the emotional side of his ARCS model, attention, relevance, competence, satisfaction. And that's a lot of what we're talking about here. So now I want to switch gears. In fact, let me ask you, is there anybody here who doesn't have something they do for fun outside of work? I don't want to see any hands, mind you. You know, you have to leave and get a life before you can come back. Right. Now think about that. Think about whatever it is, whether it's a craft or a sport or a pursuit like reading or film or theater. What is it that makes that engaging for you? What makes an experience engaging? Pardon? Participation. So you're actively playing a role. Yeah, that definitely. Sorry? An emotional connection is meaningful to you in some way, and it's evoking emotions. Motivation. So somehow you're motivated to participate in it by your own interests. There is some feedback that comes to you and that you find rewarding. Challenge, right? It's not too dull and not too frustrating, huh? Relevance, yeah, to you. Something new, the novelty, it's not entirely predictable, perhaps. Curiosity? Absolutely. And it turns out when I was a grad student, my PhD advisor was a guru of interface design. And the interface design field had gotten really excited. There was a very early computer game called Pinball Construction Set. And people played it. They didn't make great pinball games, but they were buying it and playing with it. And the interface designers were really interested in what made this such a great experience. And it really was the first to consumer drag and drop interface. You dragged over bumpers and flippers and things and placed them, and then you tried to play the game. It was horrible, but the interface experience was neat. And they got really, the interface design field got really excited about this. So they started looking at other things that made great experiences. They were trying to design good interfaces. But they looked at a number of things. They looked at theater, and they looked at books, and they looked at movies, and they looked at games and sports and Csikszentmihalyi's flow. And so I did this, and then I did it further when I was trying to understand the designing games on a principled basis. And my PhD student looked at it as well. And if you look across these elements of what makes things engaging, you find repeated elements. Not everyone is in every theory, but they show up again and again and again. Clear emergent goals, thematic coherence. You know, you don't bust out of the Western into the cafeteria of the movie lot unless you're Mel Brooks and he's a genius. Don't try this in your own home. Balanced level of challenge. Meaningfulness, what you do actually connects. What you do affects the outcome, and you care about the outcome. There's choices of action, or at least the appearance thereof. You directly operate on the world, and the world reacts to you. And Steve Draper coined this term input-output interreferentiality. It was a totally unmanageable term, but a very important concept that there's a coupling between what you do and you act on the world in ways consonant with the world, and the world reacts in ways consonant with the world. And finally, there's novelty. It's not entirely predictable. Now, the interesting thing was to me when I recognized that there is a perfect alignment. These elements are exactly the same. Clear goals, appropriate level of challenge, contextualized relevance, feedback. What makes effective education practice is the same thing that makes an engaging experience. And if you understand this, you can design experiences where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's actually hard to do good entertainment. If you look, I don't know what the Bollywood ratio is, but the Hollywood ratio is one movie success pays for about 5 flops. The computer game industry is even more heinous. One successful game pays for about 20 flops, which is why all the game companies are trying to move into serious games because they hope it's a more reliable source of money. And they have these big teams they need to support. So what we know is that learning should be hard fun. If we're doing it right, it should have that experience. It's not fun, trivial fun, not just pure the pursuit of pleasure, but that thrill, as several people were talking about, what makes an engaging experience, of reward, success. And that's what we're trying to achieve, where it's just pitched at the right level and you're making meaningful decisions and you're succeeding because it's adapted so you will. Now I want to get into some terminology because I think people throw these terms around a little too loose. What is a simulation? Technically, a simulation is just a model of a world or some subset of the world. It's a series of conceptual relationships that, and it can be in any legal state, and you can manipulate it into any other legal state. Now, a self-motivated and self-effective learner can take advantage of this. They know what they need to know, and they can go in and manipulate the simulation to find out the relationships they need to understand and go away. But that's not the way to bet. So we, as designers, as learning experience designers, try and put that simulation in initial state, or a small space of states, and ask the learner to take it to a goal state that we have chosen so that they can't get there until they understand the relationships and can successfully navigate them. And we typically wrap a story around that about why it's important to achieve that goal state. And that's what I call a scenario. Now, the simulation definition is a technical definition. This is scenario definition is mine. And I want to suggest we can tune that into a game. Note, I did not say turn it into a game. We do turn it into a game, but by tuning it, by adapting the level of frequency at which things happen and the level of difficulty, and suddenly, magically, it becomes a challenge. Microsoft Flight Simulator was not designed to be a game. It was designed to be a flight simulator for people to practice flying before they got into the more expensive simulators, before they got into a real plane. And yet people started buying it and playing it as a game, just because by serendipity, it had the right level of tuning. But we can tune deliberately. And so that to me, and by the way, I don't mean tarted up quiz shows. I don't mean those frame games that you can dump any knowledge in and then just do a random test. I'll get there. So, the question is, now if learning should be hard fun, can we reliably and repeatably do it? Because if we can't, it's a really nice idea, but it's not practical. But if we can systematically take any learning objective and design a game around it, reliably and repeatably, we have the opportunity to really improve learning practice and improve, therefore, learning outcomes. And that, to me, is a really interesting and important goal. So the question is how? And I have a claim. You can't give me a learning objective that I can't design a game for, but I reserve the right to raise the learning objective high enough in the Bloom's taxonomic sense. And I don't like Bloom's taxonomy, but that's a separate discussion, okay? But raise the level high enough, and we can make a challenging game for it. And I have not yet been proved wrong. So how do I make that claim? Well, we have to look at design processes. And if you're a learning designer, you may have heard of ADDIE. But just like I looked at all of the different types of learning, and I looked at all the different types of engagement, I also spent time looking at all sorts of different types of design, because I want to understand how to do design successfully. We have, as part of our cognitive architecture, certain traps we fall into in design, and I wanted to look at all of the ways, and then all the tricks people have come up with to get over it to try and make effective design processes. And when I looked at design, and that includes engineering design, software design, architectural design, industrial design, graphic design, and of course instructional design, some people had 3-step models. Some people had 5-step models, but I found a 4-step model is something almost anybody could understand, and many times I wasn't just talking to learning designers, so I don't need to use the ADDIE model. This is a little bit simpler, and if there's developers and things, not learning designers, they can also understand the model. So I talk about design, specification, analysis, get the information you need, specification, creating an initial design, implementation, building it, and evaluation, evaluating it. And then we do that iteratively. Because though waterfall models, design it and you get it right the first time, fails in general for people, because people don't have predictable properties like concrete. They change once they experience the system. And particularly the tuning into a game really requires iterative testing, because your initial thoughts will be maybe close if you're good, but it'll still be ways in which it can be improved. So let's talk about the analysis phase first. What we do, typically, is we gather information about what the objectives should be, what they need to be able to do at the end, and then we go look at our learners and look at what they already know, and then we try and fill the gap. But we got to do a little bit more. And I was trying to design, I understood what I was doing, but I didn't have a good hook, a good framework around which to organize it, until I heard this quote. Now you have to understand that Sid Meier is a game designer of game designers. He's like the J. Cross of game designers, okay? I mean, just everybody looks at him. And the few other people, I'm going to draw a blank. The guy who did SimCity. Will Wright. Will Wright, Chris Crawford, or a couple of the other ones, but Sid Meier's right up there. Did Civilization, did Pirates. He's just a well-renowned game designer. And he had this quote, "A good game is a series of interesting decisions." And that's where I got it. Because to me, a good, serious game is a series of important decisions. So again, we've got that alignment with a slight nuance on it. So this is the framework for me about designing games. There's a story setting that sets the context. There's the world in which you're playing. It may be very close to the real world, or it may be very fantastic. And then some situation occurs which precipitates a decision. And I want to suggest that what's going to make a difference going forward, as perhaps George suggested in his keynote this morning, that just fact remembering isn't going to make a difference out in the world. The ability to make different decisions is going to be what matters. Both for learners and in organizations, it's going to be continual innovation you need, and the increasing need to deal with ambiguity and more difficulty. So then when the decision, there's a right answer and a consequence, and wrong answers and consequences. We're going to unpack each of these a bit, okay? We're going to look at what it takes to get that right. Now this by itself is just a multiple choice question. And I have a principle that says, by the way, if you take nothing else away from this today, take the ability to write better multiple choice questions, please. But then if we have these cycle back, because decisions tend to run in packs. You make one and it leads implications for another one. And so then if we really want to capture that and immerse people in the context and get them to perform, we need to find a way to bring them back and see what the next situation is they have to deal with until they've resolved either success or failure. Right? Guys with me so far? All right, rock on. Now, I'm not interested in better facts, as I already suggested. I'm not interested in frame games that you just dump facts in. Now, once you've got the complex problems, I like, as I think I said yesterday, what Van Marienboer has as his instructional design model. He talks about the knowledge you need and the complex problems you solve with it. Now, there are times we need to get facts, but as I mentioned yesterday, subject matter experts no longer have access to what they do, and they have access to the knowledge, and so the good little instructional designer does that. And those frame games, Tarted Up Drill and Kill, are actually good if you do need to learn facts. But you need to make sure, I will bet you by and large, that the meaningful objectives that are going to lead your learners to be able to do better things and be able to go out and change the world are going to come from objectives that are not facts. And I'm not interested in better fact remembering. I'm interested in better decisions. So I want to put those decisions front and center. And what we have to do to work with subject matter experts is get those decisions out of them. And in fact, I find using the term decisions as a handle to help push back on them when they're trying to dump knowledge on you. Wait, what's that do? How does that help me actually answer a decision? That's what we need to consider. Now, when they make a decision, there are consequences. Typically, you don't make a decision and, nothing happens. It's not really interesting. It's not going to be an interesting or important decision if there are not consequences. We need to find out what those consequences are for the purposes of doing this. So, if they do this right, what happens? And if they do this wrong, what happens? Okay? So that's some additional information we're going to need to make this work. And the way our architecture works, we don't tend to make random errors. We have some randomness built in our architecture, absolutely. Evolutionary advantage for that. If we tried a little differently just by chance once in a while, and it was better we get rewarded, and gradually the world could shape our behavior. But we tend to make patterned errors because we're bringing in the wrong model, what seems like a perfectly legitimate thing. Now, these are really hard to get rid of. So we need to trap. If you hear an instructor or a subject matter go, no matter what I do, they still do this, that's a misconception. But now they're useful. Now they're really useful, and we want to trap those, and we've got to get those out of the learner as well and find out the consequences for each one differently. And I hate any piece of software that it gives you only one answer for every wrong answer, one piece of wrong feedback, because it's broken. Your alternatives to the right answer should be the ways they can go wrong, and each one needs a different type of feedback. So when you hear that, that's good news now, because that gives you the alternatives to the right answer, and making those seductive, making the wrong answer seductive so that they won't get it right until they really know it, is how you manage the challenge and make the challenge high enough. How many of you have ever taken a quiz or a test where the alternatives to the right answer were so stupid that you didn't even need to know anything to pass it. Everybody always has seen these. What a bloody waste of time. What sort of pat yourself on the back are we talking about here? Just not interesting. And we're talking about real challenge, meaningful challenge. Remember, it's hard fun. And the other thing you have to do is find where do these decisions happen in the world. You don't want just the place unless you're doing straight training, and even that's not particularly interesting. Find the different contexts, the different settings in which it has. Because one of these may be more interesting for your learners than the other ones. Or it may be easier to exaggerate it. And I'll talk about a case study either today or in the workshop where we had a challenge like that. And finally, you have to understand what the learners think is interesting, what would be a gift to them. Now here, for all the trouble subject matter experts can create elsewhere, here's where they're your best friend. I'll illustrate this through a story. After I did the game for helping kids without parents and got a name for doing games on campus, one of my colleagues came to me and said, "You do those games, right? We're doing a game. Would you be interested in helping us?" I said, "Sure, love to. What's it about?" "Computer auditing." You know, when my eyes finished rolling back at my head, I said, "I'd rather have my teeth pulled without anesthesia." And he said, "That's what I thought too." But then I talked to them. And they said, "Oh, it's like playing detective. There's an error, and you track back. Most of the time it's just a mistake. But every once in a while it's deliberate." Whoa, man, we had the story right there. Because, yeah, they tracked back, they put him and set it in a bank, and where there was an error, and eventually you find out that this guy had done it deliberately because they'd fired his mistress and he was getting back at the bank, a whole story, but you had to find this out, and then you had to do the discovery. So subject matter experts, they're pursuing this for a reason. This is their passion. This is what they live for. Find out what makes it interesting to them and bake that into the story. Tap into that, and you will do two things. You'll really help the learners understand why this is an interesting field, and you will filter out anybody for who that's not rewarding. You shouldn't be doing this. Get another job. Get another. Now, once you've done that information gathering, you have to start putting that together. I love this heuristic from Henry Jenkins. Choose a role that the player would want to be in. The player doesn't necessarily want to be down on the shop floor. They want to be the manager. Give them an interesting role, and then embed, it's sort of a dialogue. It's a dialectic between a role they want and a way to embed the decisions. But that's the creative part. To me, that's the fun part. That's the design. That's where we get to have fun. What wild stories could we tell that would get them making those decisions in the ways we want to?
What do you call it? Able to let them be a hero, don't you think that's what you should be saying? Allow the learner or the game player to be a hero.
Oh, yeah. A role they want to be in, and typically they do want to be a hero. Although there have been games where people enjoyed playing the villain. There is a game, the Dungeon Master, where you can go in and kill the players, or I think Grand Theft Auto, you're playing Criminal Minds, so.
Also games where negativity is much more difficult. The point of view is
Anti-games, okay. Anti-heroes, yes. And so it's... Now, there's a lesson here. When we developed the game for Quest for Independence, we were approached by the Children's Welfare Agency, and they wanted us to develop a game. They had these kids who live in foster care or orphanages. They don't have parents modeling going to the bank and going shopping. But at age 18, they're kicked out on their own, and they don't have any way to live. They don't know how to live on their own. So they were concerned about this, and they had a special project, and they got some money, and they spent their money on a video and a poster and a comic book. And then when they spent their money, they realized, we need a computer game. That's what the kids come in and do, if we could get a computer game. So they came to my colleague who came to me, and I had a talented student who wanted to do a meaningful honors project. But neither of us were graphic talents, as the top picture suggests. But we got the play right. We got the interaction. If you get the design right, there are lots of ways to implement it if you don't get the design right. In fact, we'd asked the counselors what should be in this game. And they said, they need to learn how to shop and how to learn how to cook. God, that's going to be fun. I could have done it. But then we actually got a chance to we couldn't talk to the kids in care because they're very protected by, because their self-esteem and government regulation. But we got to talk to some graduates who had successfully gone out and lived on the streets, and we asked them, and they said, oh, what's important is the chain. You can get money while you look for a job. So you go apply for that, but then they don't give you the money. You have to have a bank account. So you go to get a bank account, and they want ID. Now you don't have ID, so you got to go. And it's this chains of behavior that these kids found really challenging. And so that's what we baked into the game. And we, as a reward for giving us the information, we brought them back and allowed them to play the game. And the first one played it and failed. But the second one had been watching, and she played it and succeeded. And another one had come in and watched the second one, and she played it, succeeded, and the first one demanded a chance to go back and play it again. And we knew we had the play right. And indeed, they liked it, and so we went out and got I went along with them to a philanthropic organization. We got them some money, and we got some talent, actually some kids who'd succeeded and created graphic design, participated and helped create the look and feel that actually was when it was released. By the way, we then ported it to the web. As soon as I found out about CGIs, a technique for maintaining state over the web, which you need for games, and we ported it to the web. You can still play it still works. And the amazing thing is, I think it was the first serious game ever released on the web. I haven't yet been shown wrong. You need that novelty, that randomness. You need to sweat the details. Now, the moral majority would be a little bit upset in the US, and the Australian, they'd be the wowsers, but they're the people who would get upset about talking about sex and drugs. Fortunately, the Children's Welfare Agency was more concerned about saving lives. Because one of the things these kids do at age 18, and they don't know how to survive on their own, they sell their own bodies for sex, for money, and then they end up buying drugs to sort of cover the shame. And they die. And they were more interested in saving lives, so we did build in. We didn't get to build in near as much as we wanted, like the racism they might face going into civil service agencies if they're not certain races. So we built in some opportunities for them to practice safe skills, and if they had, it wasn't just about sex, but in fact they could also get prophylactics and choose to use them or not, and learn about the consequences of not using them by a probability that they would get sick. And it literally looked like a slot machine. Ding! Oops, sorry, you have a sexually transmitted disease. But this was, we had real goals, saving lives, and we were able to do that. And realize vastly different look and feels are appropriate. You don't get tied to one look. These are 3 different projects with 3 different look and feels, and yet they're appropriate for the projects. The one in the middle, for instance, looks horribly simple, but the psychiatric nurses who were the audience, our experts told us they would, in the past, had resisted anything that tried to look realistic. You could never make it look realistic enough, so we took the opposite approach and made it the minimal amount of information to communicate. This wasn't for mobile reasons or web bandwidth. It's because we wanted to allow them to infer, to map their own context as much as possible onto it. So it's sweating the details, getting it right, mapping it to the right level of image and visual appeal. And in fact, you want to strip away what's unnecessary. You want to focus just on the minimal. So here's a game. It was designed for, I'm not going to, but very limited dialogue, graphic representation of how you're doing, the controls to get to the places you need, and little else. That's actually relatively simple graphics, but we wanted to immerse people and use a lot of visual clues because in many ways that's how we interpret the world, at least for the audience we were shooting for here. And the main reason I'm being kind of alluded to is we're going to go back to this in the workshop. But I like this quote. For all that you want to immerse them, you want to strip away anything unnecessary. Partly for cognitive overhead, cognitive load, but also so people can map as much of it themselves. I like to put the player, get the view that the character would have so they can maximally immerse. You don't want to show them the character, unless they can customize it so it looks like them. There's nuances. Now, we can implicitly map a lot of the world in a branching scenario. Essentially, the rules of the world are implicit in the links. But at a certain level of complexity, this is only 2 decisions at each point at 4 levels of depth. we've got 32 different states we have to try and keep track of. There are tools that make this somewhat easier, but branching scenarios have limited replay. So at some point, it's worth it to map it into a real simulation, capture the world in a model and a set of rules to carry it forward. And that is challenging. Not everybody can do that. If you can write a macro, or if you can program, and even those people, some people who program in sort of hard coding mechanisms and still raw software engineering aren't the right people, because you've got to figure out what to separate out in different places, because you will have to tune it. And that means you're going to have to change the values. And if somebody captured the world wrong and hard coded it, it doesn't work. So you guys just working okay for you so far? How are we doing? Oh, okay. So really, to me, the process looks roughly like this. You get the objectives and make sure they're high enough level, meaningful decisions that they're really going to need to be able to perform out there. You characterize the audience, particularly in terms of their interests. You transform the objectives to decisions, get the misconceptions, consequences, brainstorm storylines, and you capture that in a concept doc. Typically, in a large project, you just get all this and you wouldn't put the storyline in, but on a small project, it just cuts out one loop if you actually capture what the main characters, what the main storyline, what the main variables are going to be in, and get sign off on that. Because here, you got to get sign off by your clients, whoever it is. Internal, external, doesn't matter. You want to get the subject matter and the client to sign off. You want to constrain that. You guys probably know about the experience of scope creep, where so you give them the document and they get you the feedback. And so okay, I'm going forward, and you start working, and then they go, oh, I got feedback from somebody else. I got feedback from somebody else, and eventually you get conflicting feedback. My reaction is that all the feedback? Or if you've got anybody else, just circle it, so I'm not going to start yet. I want one piece of document. In other words, I write in the contracts. I will give you an initial version. You get all the feedback you want. You give me one bit of feedback, and I'll revise on the basis of that. Anything else is scope change, but hard-won lesson. And then after that, you need to get down to a storyboard, and there's a number of different ways you can break it out depending on your team. Too often, people tend to make the mistake of they don't get a professional writer they think they can write. They never think to use an amateur graphic designer. But for somebody to think writing, but get the tools you need, the programmers, and you break it up. Well, you don't have the programmers yet, although it's useful to have them as part of the team. But you've got to generate a look and feel, you've got to get your dialogue, you've got to get the rules, and eventually you'll capture that in a storyboard that you'll move forward with and take it to the developers. Let's talk about implementation and evaluation. I already mentioned this. If you don't get the design right, it doesn't matter how you implement it. If you get the design right, there are lots of ways to implement it. No editorial comment there at all, right? So get the design right first, and then you'll be amazed at the number of levels of technical sophistication that will matter. And you can decide whether the market opportunity, the importance of getting people to do it right, what your level of implementation is, but get the right experience. And Will Wright told me tuning is 9/10 of the effort. You think building the program, the initial version, is a lot of effort, and it is. And SimCity, which he was talking about when he talked about this, multi-level cellular automata connected by rules with a visual interface. He said building that was 1/10 of the effort. Tuning it was 9/10 of the effort. Now, he's trying to get commercial level of play that you're willing to pay 40 or 60 bucks for, okay? You may have some sticks as well as carrots, like if you don't do this, you don't pass, you don't get so-and-so. But realize there will be tuning. There should be tuning, because that optimizes learning experience. So I want to suggest learning can be hard fun. We can do this reliably, repeatably, and we should. Thank you very much. And I deliberately ended a little early, so we have time for some questions. Please.
Game learning.
So when we play games, we don't, while we playing game, we are very assertive.
We're very assertive?
In the sense...
Is that what you said? Did I hear you correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we are more assertive. And actually when we are applying it in real life, we are not that.
Yes, I absolutely agree. One of the things partly because there's high risk. So one of the things I argue for, that whole tuning the experience, is exaggeration. That's one of your biggest tools as a designer. Exaggerate the importance. Instead of saving a patient, you're saving the ambassador's daughter. Instead of, figuring out a good sale, this sale, if it doesn't happen, the company folds. Ramp it up, because when they're out in the real world, they're going to have a lot of emotion attached. So we want to build that emotion into the learning experience as closely as possible to match the level of engagement. So, and I have a claim: exaggerate much more than you think you'll get away with. And then fight tooth and nail for it. Because your subject matter is, we can't treat that in that wild a way, and your client might go, we can't treat that, but your learners will thank you. So fight for them. There was a question back there.
Sir, you just mentioned that you don't believe in facts. But then, if you don't have any support data, why would somebody actually have a product?
Sorry?
You just mentioned about that you don't believe in facts.
I don't believe in facts?
You just mentioned...
No, I don't believe in facts. I don't think fact recitation is going to lead to meaningful change out in the world. I think decisions, skills mean what's going to change in the world. Sorry, if that was misconstrued, I deeply apologize. I absolutely believe in, I'm a scientist and I believe in facts and evidence, but I don't think just the ability to recite facts is going to make you any better able to solve problems out in the world. In fact, in cognitive science, we call that inert knowledge. They'll pass the test, they'll study the knowledge and they'll pass the test, and they'll go out in the real world where it's relevant, and it won't even get activated because they've never applied it. They've never done it. So sorry if I was confusing on that, please.
I have a question. See, ideally, we should develop game virtually for every concept in curriculum. Ideally, we should develop game for virtually every concept in curriculum in any subject. But developing a game is very costly. So how do you decide which one to pick up?
Totally whatever somebody's whim and ego is, typically is the real answer. But by and large, where it's going to make a big difference. To me, it's the outcome. If having that skill is going to make them much better able to do whatever it is, make a better sale or be more effective in business, I would do that before something that's kind of marginal. I challenge your assumption that it's going to be very costly, by the way. Like I said, if you get the design right, there are lots of ways to implement it. Branching scenarios you can do in very low tech. You can do it in PowerPoint, you can do it in raw HTML. So I challenge that it has to be costly, get the design right, and then figure out how to do it. But when it comes to periodization, it's the same periodization you do on anything else. Whatever's going to make a difference, the biggest difference in the world.
So you'd said it's a question here. You'd said that you hadn't yet come across a subject area where you hadn't been able to come up with a design. Could you just give us some idea where it was significantly harder than you had thought it would be initially?
Yes. One of the challenges for me was the hard example is ultrasound. We were demonstrating to a publisher, they had an ultrasound curriculum, then they wanted to turn people into ultrasound technicians, right, for medical technicians. It wasn't the ultrasound that was difficult, it was the preliminary stuff. Like, what are the properties of a good transducer, which later is a foundation for stuff, and yet I wanted them to apply it. So I had to figure out a way where they were still using that knowledge to make meaningful decisions that would both make an engaging scenario and set them up for the more interesting ones that would come when they really had the knowledge put together and could actually start doing imaging on things. So I had to create a story about robot ultrasound repair, and they had to figure out transducers. But yeah. I would love to continue the discussion. I'm mindful of the time that my colleagues are scheduled to start presenting now, and I'm greatly, particularly after my experience yesterday, respect when people manage to keep to time. So I assume Viplav would like me to, but I'm happy to stick around, be available for questions afterwards, and I'll be here tomorrow, so we'll continue the discussion. Sorry.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.